Here's how medieval hospitality worked. It was a big deal. People back then traveled differently than we do today. There were no cars, no trains, no planes. Travel was slow and dangerous. Because of this, hospitality was not just a nice thing to do. It was essential, it kept society working, it kept people alive. Hospitality was a lifeline in the Middle Ages. You couldn't just book a hotel online. Inns existed, but they were often few and far between. Many were dirty, unsafe, and expensive, so when you traveled, you relied on the kindness of strangers. Or, more often, the obligation of strangers. This wasn't just about being friendly. It was a fundamental part of life. Think about it. Roads were bad. They were often just dirt tracks. They could be muddy, flooded, or covered in snow. Bandits were a real threat. Wild animals were also a danger. And traveling alone or with a small group was risky. You needed a safe place to stop. You needed food and water, you needed shelter from the weather, and you needed protection for the night. This is where hospitality came in. It was a social contract. Everyone understood it. If you were a traveler, you needed hospitality. If you were a settled person, you were expected to offer it. This expectation wasn't just a suggestion, it was deeply woven into the fabric of medieval society. It was a matter of honor for the host. It was a matter of survival for the guest. There were strong religious reasons for offering hospitality too. Christianity taught that you should welcome the stranger. Many believed that Christ himself could appear as a traveler, so turning someone away could be seen as turning away God. The monasteries, in particular, took this duty very seriously. They often had guest houses. They fed the poor and housed pilgrims. This was a core part of their mission. It earned them spiritual merit. But it wasn't just monks. Even ordinary peasants would offer what they could. A shared meal, a corner by the fire, a bed of straw. It might not be much, but it could mean the difference between life and death for a traveler caught in a storm. Or for someone who ran out of supplies. For the wealthy, like lords and ladies, hospitality was also a display. It showed their power, it showed their generosity. A great lord was expected to have an open door. He would welcome other nobles, messengers, and sometimes even large retinues. This boosted his reputation. It showed he was a good, powerful leader. It also helped him gather information. Travelers brought news from other regions. They brought gossip, they brought political updates. So, hospitality wasn't just charity, it was a form of communication. It was a way to maintain connections between different parts of the kingdom. It built alliances, it strengthened social bonds. If a lord was known for being stingy or unwelcoming, it would hurt his standing. Other nobles might not trust him. His influence would shrink. There was also a concept called guest friendship. This was especially important in more ancient times, but it carried through. If you offered hospitality to someone, you formed a bond. They became your guest friend. This meant you had a mutual obligation to help each other. It was like an unofficial alliance. It could last for generations. A host would protect his guest. A guest would remember the kindness. They might return it later. This was vital in a world with no strong central government. Local relationships mattered a lot, but there were also rules. A guest couldn't just show up and demand endless hospitality. There were limits. A common traveler might be expected to move on after a day or two. A noble guest might stay longer, but they were still guests. They had to behave well. They couldn't overstay their welcome, they couldn't abuse the host's generosity. To do so would be a huge insult. It could lead to conflict, and there were legal aspects too. Sometimes a traveler might carry letters of safe conduct. These were like official passes. They guaranteed a certain level of protection and hospitality. This was often for merchants or important messengers. But even without such letters, local customs often dictated how travelers should be treated. Breaking these customs could lead to trouble. Hospitality, then, was a complex system. It combined religious duty, social expectation, political strategy, and personal survival. It was how people moved from one place to another. It was how news spread. It was how communities connected. And it was how people looked out for each other in a tough world. It wasn't always perfect, but it was always there. It was the backbone of travel in the Middle Ages, and without it, life would have been much harder, much more isolated. When you think of medieval hospitality, grand castles often come to mind, and for good reason. Lords and ladies in their castles were major players in the hospitality game. They hosted on a grand scale. This was a part of their duty. It was also a display of their power and wealth. Who stayed in castles? All sorts of people. Other powerful lords and their retinues would be frequent guests. They came to discuss politics, they came to form alliances, they came for celebrations like weddings or feasts. These noble guests expected the best. They expected lavish meals, they expected comfortable lodging, and they expected entertainment. But it wasn't just high-ranking visitors. Messengers came and went. They carried news and letters. They needed a place to rest and feed their horses. Minstrels and performers also traveled from castle to castle. They brought music, stories, and entertainment. They were often welcomed for the diversion they offered. Even humble pilgrims on their way to holy sites might seek shelter at a castle gate. And, of course, the Lord's own family and many servants lived there. The scale of hospitality could be massive. A great feast could mean hundreds of people. The castle's great hall was the heart of this. It was where everyone gathered. It was where meals were served. Important guests might have their own private chambers. These would be warmed by a fireplace. They would have a proper bed. Lesser guests, like squires or minor officials, might sleep in the great hall itself. They would lie on straw or pallets. The host, the lord, had many duties. He had to provide food and drink. This meant a lot of hunting, farming, and brewing. He had to ensure there was enough for everyone. He also had to protect his guests. Their safety while on his lands was his responsibility. The guests harmed in a lord's castle reflected badly on the lord. This was a point of honor. Guests also had duties. They were expected to be polite. They brought news and stories. Sometimes they brought gifts. A gift was a sign of respect. It also helped to cement the relationship. But the most important thing was to not cause trouble. Disrespecting the host or his family was a serious offense. For the truly important guests, the welcome would be elaborate. The lord might ride out to meet them. He would escort them back to the castle with fanfare. There would be special ceremonies. A multi-course banquet would be served. Fine wines and ales would flow freely. Jugglers, musicians, and jesters would perform. This was all part of the show. It was a way to impress and honor the guest. The castle household was a huge operation. It needed many people to run it. The chamberlain managed the lord's private rooms and guest chambers. The steward oversaw the kitchens and dining. Cooks prepared the food. Servants waited on tables. Grooms looked after horses. Guards watched the gates. Everyone had a role in making sure guests were well looked after. Security was always a concern. Castles were built for defense, after all. Strangers arriving needed to be vetted. Guards at the gate would question travelers. They would decide who was allowed in and who wasn't. An uninvited, unknown group could be a threat. So, while hospitality was key, so was caution. Food was a central part of castle hospitality. A lord's table would be laden with meat. Roasted, boar, venison, beef, fowl, fish on fast days. Bread was a staple. Cheese and fresh vegetables were also common. Spices were used to show off wealth. Wine and ale were drunk in large quantities. The more food and drink offered, the more generous and powerful the lord seemed. Water was less common for drinking. People drank ale or wine instead. This was safer. The brewing process made it less likely to carry disease. The sheer amount of provisions needed for a large household, plus guests, was immense. This is why lords owned vast estates. They needed to produce everything they consumed. Guests might stay for days, weeks, or even longer, especially if they were important figures. Or if they were family. Sometimes they might even become permanent residents. They would join the lord's retinue. This could happen for young nobles seeking training, or for scholars and artists who found patronage. The Great Hall was usually a bustling place. It was not just for eating, it was for justice, for entertainment, for gatherings. Even servants and guards might sleep there. Only the most important people got private rooms. This communal living was very different from our modern ideas of privacy. So, hospitality in a castle was about more than just food and a bed. It was a political act, it was a social ritual, it was a religious duty, it was a show of status, and it required a vast amount of resources and organization. It cemented relationships. It spread influence, and it kept the social wheels turning in a complex, often dangerous world. It was a cornerstone of noble life. Monasteries played a unique and vital role in medieval hospitality. They weren't just places for monks to pray, they were often true havens for travelers, the sick, and the poor. This was a core part of their religious mission. Many monastic orders had rules about welcoming strangers. They saw it as a direct command from God. Think of a monastery as a self-sufficient village. It had fields, workshops, kitchens, and dormitories, and almost always a guest house. These guest houses were usually separate from the monks' living quarters. This kept the monks' contemplative life undisturbed. But It also offered a more comfortable and often safer stay for visitors. The abbot, the head of the monastery, was usually in charge of greeting guests. He would ensure they were well fed and cared for. Important guests might even be entertained in the abbot's own chambers. Less important guests would stay in the common guest house. Monastic hospitality was different from a lord's castle. It was less about display and more about charity and religious duty. The food, while often good and plentiful, might not be as lavish as a noble banquet. But it was always wholesome. Guests would usually eat in a common hall. They would eat the same food as the monks, or something similar. Ale and sometimes wine would be served. There were rules. Most monasteries had limits on how long a guest could stay. A common stay might be 1 to 3 nights. This was to prevent people from taking advantage of the hospitality. It also ensured resources weren't overstretched. Some exceptions were made for very important people or those truly in need. Pilgrims were especially welcome. They were on a holy journey. Monks felt a special connection to them. Many monasteries were built along pilgrimage routes. They became vital stopping points. Pilgrims could find rest, spiritual guidance, and food. They often didn't have much money. So monastic charity was essential for them. But monasteries did more than just house travelers. They were also the origin of many hospitals. The word hospital in the Middle Ages didn't always mean a place for just the sick. It meant a place for guests. These hospitals often cared for the poor, the elderly, and the infirm. They provided shelter, food, and basic care. Many monastic orders took on the specific task of caring for the sick and the destitute. The Knights Hospitaller, for example, started as an order to care for pilgrims in Jerusalem. They built hospitals and offered medical care. Other smaller monastic institutions across Europe did similar work. They often had infirmaries. These were specifically for sick monks and also for sick guests. The spiritual reward for offering hospitality was a huge motivator. Monks believed that by serving guests, especially the poor and sick, they were serving God. This was a way to show their faith. It was a path to salvation. It was also a way to gain favor in the community. People respected monasteries that were generous. However, offering hospitality was not always easy for monasteries. It was a huge strain on their resources. They had to feed many mouths. They had to provide lodging. This meant maintaining buildings. They also had to deal with all sorts of people. Some guests might be rowdy, some might be diseased. So while it was a duty, it also presented challenges. Despite the challenges, monasteries were often the most reliable place to find help. They were usually safer than inns. They were more predictable. They offered a sense of security and care that was hard to find elsewhere. They were also places of learning. A traveling scholar might find a library and educated company in a monastery. The layout of a monastery often reflected its hospitality function. Near the main gate, there would be the almonry. This was where alms were given to the poor. Food and drink would be distributed. Sometimes basic shelter was offered there too. The guest house would be a bit further in. It would be a self-contained unit with its own kitchen and sleeping quarters. So, monasteries provided a unique form of medieval hospitality. It was driven by religious ideals. It was less about show and more about genuine care. They offered sanctuary, nourishment, and sometimes medical attention. They served pilgrims, the poor, the sick, and ordinary travelers. They were vital institutions that filled a huge need in a time when travel was tough. Their commitment to welcoming the stranger left a lasting mark on the concept of charity and care. As medieval society grew and travel became more common, private hospitality wasn't always enough. This led to the rise of commercial establishments, inns, taverns, and alehouses. These were businesses. They offered services for a fee. They served a different kind of traveler than the noble guest in a castle or the pilgrim in a monastery. Inns were the most comprehensive. They were like early hotels. You could find them in towns. You could also find them along major roads. An inn offered lodging, food, drink, and stabling for horses. If you were a merchant, a traveling craftsman, or just someone without noble connections, an inn was your best bet. Taverns were usually smaller. They focused mostly on selling wine. Some might offer simple food like bread and cheese. They were more for local people to socialize and drink. They often didn't have lodging. Alehouses were even simpler. Often they were just a room in someone's home. The owner would brew ale and sell it to neighbors. They were common in villages. They rarely offered lodging. They were the most basic option for a drink and some company. The quality of inns varied hugely. Some were decent. They might have a common room with a fire. They might have private rooms for wealthier guests. But many were quite rough. They could be dirty. They could be noisy. and they could be dangerous. Dangers in inns were real, thieves might target travelers known to carry money. Poor sanitation was common. Bedbugs and fleas were a constant problem. Fires were also a risk. Overcharging was also an issue. Landlords knew travelers were often desperate. Sleeping arrangements at inns were usually communal. It was common for guests to share beds. You might find yourself sleeping next to a stranger. Or you might sleep in the common room on a bench or the floor. Private rooms were rare and expensive. They were usually only for the richest guests. This communal sleeping was normal for the time. People were used to less privacy. Food and drink at inns were usually simple: a stew, some bread, an ale, or wine. The quality depended on the inn. It might be good, it might be barely edible. Meals were often eaten communally in the common room. This was a chance for travelers to share news. They could also get into arguments. The landlord of an inn had a tricky job. He had to be a businessman. He had to attract customers. He also had to maintain order. He had to deal with all sorts of people. Some would be polite. Others would be drunk and rowdy. He was also responsible for his guests' safety to some extent. But he also had to make a living. The cost of an inn stay varied. It depended on what you needed. A bed, a meal, and stabling for a horse cost money. This meant inns were often for those who could afford it. Poor travelers might try to find work, or they might rely on charity, or they might just sleep rough. Cities and large towns had more inns. They were often regulated by the local authorities. There might be rules about pricing, there might be inspections, but these rules were not always enforced. Many inns operated with little oversight. Some inns became famous. They were known for good service. They were known for good food. They would be mentioned in travel accounts. Other inns gained bad reputation. They were known for their dangers. They were places to avoid. The rise of inns was a sign of a changing world. More people were traveling for business. More people were moving between towns. They needed places to stay that weren't dependent on social obligation. They needed commercial services. This marked a shift. Hospitality became less about a social duty. It became more about a transaction, but even in inns, a certain level of hospitality was expected. A landlord was expected to be welcoming. He was expected to provide basic services. Even if you paid for it, a warm fire, a decent meal, and a safe place to sleep were valued. Good service kept customers coming back. It also spread word of mouth. So, inns, taverns, and alehouses represented the commercial side of medieval hospitality. They filled a growing need for travelers who couldn't rely on castles or monasteries. They offered a range of services, from a simple drink to a full stay. They were often rough and ready. But they were essential. They allowed ordinary people to travel further and more often. They were a crucial part of the medieval travel infrastructure. Medieval hospitality, as we've seen, was a complex mix of duty, religion, social expectation, and commerce. It wasn't just a quaint custom. It was a vital system that kept people moving, connected, and safe. And while the practicalities have changed, many of its core ideas still resonate today. One major shift was the decline of forced private hospitality. As commercial inns became more widespread and reliable, people had other options. They didn't have to rely on the generosity of a local lord or peasant. This meant less social pressure to open your home to every stranger. Travel became less about imposing on others and more about purchasing a service. This was a slow change, but it was significant. The concept of the stranger also changed. In a world where travel was rare, a stranger was often a specific type of guest. They might be a messenger, a pilgrim, or someone with a clear purpose. As more people moved around, the idea of a stranger became more generalized. They were less likely to be seen as a potential guest friend and more as a customer. But the spiritual and social values tied to hospitality didn't just disappear. The idea of welcoming the stranger, of helping those in need, remains powerful. Many modern charities and humanitarian organizations have roots in these medieval traditions. Think of homeless shelters, food banks, or even modern hostels. They all offer a form of basic hospitality to those who need it. Today, we have bed and breakfasts, hotels, motels, and Airbnb. These are direct descendants of medieval inns and guest houses. They offer a paid service. But a good host still aims to make guests feel welcome and comfortable. The idea of good services is still about more than just a transaction. It's about creating a pleasant experience. The monastery's role in care also evolved. Modern hospitals, while vastly different in their medical capabilities, still carry the name and the underlying mission of care for the sick and infirm. They are places of refuge and healing. Much like their monastic predecessors, hospitality still acts as a measure of a society's civility. How we treat visitors, immigrants, or those in need says a lot about us. A society that provides for its vulnerable, that welcomes newcomers, is often seen as more humane. This echoes the medieval ideal of the good host. The enduring power of a warm welcome is still real. Whether it's a friend inviting you for dinner or a hotel concierge greeting you, that sense of being wanted and cared for matters. It helps you feel safe. It helps you relax. It creates a sense of belonging, even if temporary. Even today, when we travel, we seek connection, safety, and nourishment. The practicalities are different. We have GPS, we have credit cards, but the underlying human needs haven't changed. We still want a comfortable place to sleep. We still want good food. We still want to feel secure. And we still appreciate genuine kindness. So, while medieval hospitality might seem like a distant, archaic system, its echoes are all around us. It taught us the importance of community, it showed us the value of generosity, and it laid the groundwork for how we think about welcoming others, whether they are friends, strangers, or those in need. It reminds us that at its heart, hospitality is about human connection, it's about looking out for each other, it's about making the world a bit kinder, one welcome at a time.